Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for spending your time with Hilarie and I today. I'm Laura Doherty. I am the National Clinical Manager at Functional Formularies, and I'm really excited for our webinar today. It's Blending Brilliance, Mastering Administration and Troubleshooting of Whole Food Blenderized Tube Feeding. Just a few housekeeping things. Everybody will be on mute throughout the webinar, but at the end or anytime throughout, you can go ahead and put a question in the question feature and go to webinar. And Hilarie and I will get to those at the end. This webinar has been approved for one continuing education unit for dietitians and dietitian technicians. So those emails will go out by the end of the day tomorrow. So you'll get an email that has your certificate, the references, and a survey link to provide us feedback. So like the end of the day tomorrow, I'll be looking for that or earlier. And then there also is in the handout section of GoToWebinar a copy of the slide deck and references. So if you want those copies, please go to the handout section. If you can't find that section in GoToWebinar, that's okay. Just shoot me a message in the question and I can send them to you as well. So lots of different options for getting those to you. So without further ado, I want to introduce Hilarie Geurink. I so appreciate her time. She is truly an expert on blenderized tube feeding. She is a registered dietitian and a certified specialist in pediatric who has been helping families with tube feeding for over 8 years. She is the owner and founder of Blended Tube Feeding, a private practice dedicated to helping those fed by feeding tube incorporate real food into their routine so they can feel better and share in family meals. Prior to starting her private practice, she worked as a clinical dietitian at a children's hospital in Michigan, and she completed her dietetic internship at the University of California, Davis Medical Center, and her undergrad degree at Michigan State University. So with that, Hilarie, I'm going to hand it over to you and get started.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. I know at least when I was getting started with blenderized tube feeding, there just wasn't a lot out there. My patients were asking me for this, and when I was still in the hospital system, and I really felt like there wasn't a lot of practical knowledge and tips out there to help me feel confident helping patients. So I really hope today you guys leave this feeling much more confident that you can help your patients that are looking forward to getting started with this. So on this side, you will see my disclosures. So what are we going to learn today? We're going to go over a lot, but what I hope to empower you with is figuring out who is even appropriate for a blenderized diet. Then we're going to go over a lot of practical stuff. How to blend safely? How can they avoid things like clogged feeding tubes and food safety concerns? How do you help patients actually pick out what they're going to blend and actually feed these blended meals? And then we'll go over some things like common challenges that might come up, things that you might hear as concerns, and how can you help your patients really be successful at this long term. So I think it's important to first go over like what is blenderized tube feeding. So really it's just food and liquid added to a blender and then blended to a thin enough consistency that it can flow through a feeding tube. So I like to think of this as, for people who eat by mouth, we are chewing our food, it's going into our mouth and then into our digestive tract. With a blenderized diet, the blending is doing that chewing for you, and then instead of your mouth, it's going through a feeding tube. So there's a lot of ways that this can look. I think we all often think it's like an all or nothing approach, but a lot of families will do a combination of things. So as you can see here, it can be just really just blending all your food at home. You can use commercial products that are real food based, have real food in them, or 100% real food, or you can do a combination of things. I want to go over a little history because I know I was surprised when I first saw this. I'm not sure what I thought. I don't know if I thought like formula and tube feeding were just created at the same time, but actually before we had formula, we had feeding tubes and hospitals would blend the food. So that's what they would send up to their patients. But in the 1950s through the 1970s is when formula started to be created, and then it really started to take off as more and more formulas became on the market. Hospitals saw this as a more safe option. It was sterile, easier to use, and this is really how it started to take off. I don't know for you guys, but at least for me, this is what I was taught. I didn't even know that real food was an option, and it was formula only through a feeding tube. But over the last couple decades, there's really been a push for just real food in general, I think, no matter how you eat, and this really hasn't been lost on the tube feeding community. A lot of people are expressing interest in using real food for a lot of different reasons. And this has been studied. So there are quite a few studies out there that are showing just more and more people are interested in blended tube feeding. So this one I found really interesting. This was written in 2015, around the time when infant connectors were coming on the market and this was being introduced. And the authors of this study had been working with patients for over 25 years, thousands and thousands and thousands of patients. And over those years, a lot of people had told them that they were doing real food. They didn't have any evidence of this. And their concern was that with these new connectors, it wasn't going to work well with the real food and adequate adapters had to be developed. So they did a study and found that as many as 55% of adult patients receiving home enteral nutrition were using blenderized tube feeding. And of those who weren't doing blenderized tube feeding, actually 80% of them expressed an interest in it if they had more adequate information. And this was done now almost 10 years ago, right? So in my opinion and what I've seen, this is just increasingly growing. More and more people are interested in this. So it might be curious, why is there a growing interest? And I think there's a lot of reasons for this, but I want to go over four main reasons that I see, at least in my practice, and then you often see in the literature. So one of them is to address gastrointestinal intolerance. We know our patients are struggling, right? They are looking for relief. They're not getting relief from current practices. So they're turning to online communities. They're asking their friends, people who they know, what are you doing? And they're hearing that real food has made a big difference. But people also want some flexibility in their diet. We know with a single formula routine, it's really hard to have flexibility and it's hard to adhere to specific dietary preferences. And again, people want that better quality nutrition. They want to have more diversity in their diet and they want to use more whole foods. And then also there's this emotional connection with food, right? So it can be pretty disconnecting to only be able to use formula, to not be able to share family meals, to miss out on holidays. And as we know, food is so much more than nutrition. And so people really want to be able to participate and have some normalcy when it comes to their tube feeding. So I quickly want to go into, just dive into gastrointestinal intolerance and why blenderized tube feeding actually makes a big difference and why our typical approach actually can make things worse for patients. I think as clinicians, this is our main point, right? We're trying to help our patients feel better. We're trying to help them relieve their digestive symptoms. And so often when people have things like the upper GI symptoms like reflux, vomiting, gagging, retching, our typical path is the things listed here. A lot of formula changes, a lot of adjustments to the volume and the rate. So we are asking them to do smaller, more frequent feeds, to slow down those feeds, to start overnight feeds, even go from gastric post-caloric feeds. And of course, so many medications, right, that are often just treating the symptoms. They're not actually fixing anything. And so I think as clinicians, we don't always recognize the extent of the challenges that these create for our patients, because on our end it's working. It's making them, as far as the symptom management, that's we don't see that the reflux is getting better, but in reality in the home, this is causing a lot of headaches for the family. So formula changes mean so many calls to insurance companies, the formula shortage issues. When we make these plans to the point where families are basically feeding around the clock, that is hard. That's a lot of around the clock demand. And plus it is just, there's no steadiness in the routine. And of course too, they feel so defeated because it's working, but they have to continue to do this in order for the symptoms to stay in control. And then with our lower GI symptoms, this is things like constipation and diarrhea. And how we help our families with this is, again, lots of formula changes, right? Trying to find that perfect formula that's going to make them feel better. And we know, right, that causes a lot of stress for the families, having to find it, change DMEs, all the insurance stuff. A lot of fluid management, right, with things like constipation and diarrhea. And we know it is hard to get our patients to get enough fluid. They are often pretty maxed out. And again, all those medications and over-the-counter prescription or over-the-counter medications, right? This is just, again, band-aiding the problem often. They feel very frustrated. They feel like nothing's going to change and they're very overwhelmed. But real food really helps stop this cycle and actually can make a difference to not just band-aid the problem, but really get to the root cause. So you might be curious, well, why does real food actually make a big difference? And there are a lot of proposed explanations out there. As we know, nutrition research is hard. It's really hard to get cause and effect. We just find correlations with things. And so the things listed here are really what people feel is making the biggest difference. And I can say, even, working with so many families now through this, I see this as well. So one of the biggest things is real food is often much thicker than, or I shouldn't say much thicker, but it's often thicker than commercial standard products. So for example, I primarily have worked with pediatric patients who really struggle with reflux. And those kiddos often, because they have struggled with reflux, they have sensitive gag reflex, maybe they have a trach and they're managing their secretions, or they're sick and they're coughing all the time, or they're laying down, or they're just moving all the time. That thin formula comes up so much easier than a little bit thicker product or home prepared meals. And so the thicker product actually sits heavier in their stomach, and so it doesn't come up as quickly. And this makes, I mean, this small change makes a huge, huge difference for patients, especially those pediatric patients with reflux and vomiting. But another thought is that real food really mimics more of what our body is used to consuming or is typical for our human bodies to consume. And so it just is a more natural movement of the food through our digestive tract, which really helps them with digestive issues. And then lastly, I already touched on this a little bit, but real food offers the opportunity for more diet diversity. So when we have patients who are eating by mouth and they have some sort of GI issue or some sort of discomfort, so often we're able to help them tweak their diet to be able to feel better, right? And so with real food, or I'm sorry, with a formula, single formula routine, it's really hard to make those changes, but when you have the opportunity for more diet diversity and flexibility, you can manage those digestive issues a lot easier. So quickly, I want to go through a case study that really represents a lot of patients I've worked with and really shows the power of real food helping with GI discomfort. So this little kiddo, she was born not really with any major medical concerns at the beginning. She had some latch issues, but through that first year of life, she really started to regress with her oral intake, not really taking a bottle as well as she used to, and her puree intake started to struggle. And when she got closer to that year mark, she was taking maybe a few ounces a few times a day. And so obviously she had pretty poor weight gain. So at 15 months, she was admitted for a feeding tube placement and was diagnosed with malnutrition. The team started her on amino acid formula because they thought maybe it's suspected food allergies that are causing her oral aversion. So they started her on amino acid formula, and the feeding therapist who saw her inpatient recommended that they do 100% of her nutrition through her feeding tube. She noticed a lot of negative association with her eating, and she wanted her just get her nutrition through her feeding tube, and then we'll work with her in feeding therapy. But unfortunately, she really struggled with her tube feeds. So she was not getting very much food to begin with, and now we're trying to meet all of her needs with formula, and her stomach had likely gotten smaller. And so she really struggled with gagging, retching, constipation from the beginning, despite so many changes. So lots of formula changes that we talked about, peptide formulas, real food-based formulas. They tried to slow down the feeds, pump feeds. They got to the point where I would say more hours in the day she was getting her feeds through the pump than not, and that was the only way to keep her reflux and vomiting under control. And so because of this, she was regressing in her feeding therapy. So family reached out to me. Like I said, right, they're seeking alternative solutions. She heard online that real food could help, but she knew she needed some support with this. So I'm going to go through like a very, very high level overview of what we did, and we'll get into the more details later in this talk. But for her, since she really struggled with constipation, I really wanted to focus on her fluid intake, because I think she was getting like, I don't know, 70 to 80% of her fluids, and that was causing constipation. And then we know, or I know, at least I've seen this a lot in my practice, when kiddos are constipated, they puke more and they're more refluxy. So we improved her bowel regularity first, and then we slowly started to test out real food. Because she struggled with reflux, I wanted to keep it a little bit thicker. Obviously, it still needs to pass through the feeding tube, but that seemed to really help with her reflux. And we used recipes that were calorie matched to her formula. So she was on a 1.5 calorie per ml formula. So we used a recipe that was also 1.5 calorie per ml. This made it really easy to slowly swap out formula for thicker blended food. Mom was able to increase her variety with a lot of recipes, and she was doing so much better in just a few weeks that we were able to go from her pump feeds to syringe feedings, which then helped too because the feeding time was shorter. We could increase the volume, and of course then she started to gain weight with more calories. So just a few weeks to a month, her vomiting had completely resolved. Her oral intake started to increase, but I think the coolest thing is Mom was like, you know, I'm feeling like a parent again, and I feel like something I'm doing for my daughter is making a big difference. And it's so cool to have a sense of normalcy, to be able to cook for her and make this a little bit less medical. And of course, every parent wants their child to be happy and healthy, and she felt like they were finally on a path for this. So now we're going to jump into how you can help your patients have the same sort of transformation. So the first thing that needs to be considered is, or first thing we need to talk about is who is even appropriate. So I hope to surprise you that probably more patients than you think are actually appropriate for this, but this comes from the Aspen practice guidelines that were released September 2023. So that was in the reference here, and you'll see that at the end too, but great resource. But really what needs to be considered, one thing is age. We're not going to give a 2-month-old a blenderized diet. But you might be surprised to hear that it's actually appropriate to start as soon as 6 months, based on the patient, of course, but at 6 months, it should be considered. So this can look a lot like any infant eating by mouth. So Aspen recommends no more than 25% of the nutrition to start to come from real food. The rest needs to be the formula or the breast milk, and then work towards 100% real food as they get closer to a year. And this is the same for our oral eaters, right? So it can look the same. Single foods, test things out. We're just getting started with infants who eat by mouth. It's not really meeting, or it's not really their nutrition intake, right? It's just testing things out. Same thing with the tube feed. But we also need to consider the type and size of the feeding tube. So Aspen suggests or says preference is a G tube that's 14 French or larger, but we can use different tubes with special care and considerations. So as low as 10 French has been used in studies successfully. And I would say in my practice, primarily working with pediatric patients, a lot of them have 12 French and it works fine. Questions about GJ tubes and nasogastric tubes. Again, probably 10 French or larger in consideration with making sure the particle size is small enough and it's really in liquid form is very important. But just know that it is okay. It just really depends on the patient's situation. And then we need to consider medical stability. So patients who are in the ICU or going through acute healthcare crisis, probably not the best time to start a blended diet, but maybe it's something that they can consider later. Or if you have families who just have a lot going on with their child medically. I had a patient who they were working on a trach, weaning her trach. They just didn't feel like it was the best time to try something new. And then of course too, we really need to take into consideration the patient and caregiver capacity and resources. But I do want to challenge your thinking on this because I think so often it's more what we have capacity for and our own resources rather than being able to be informed to be able to help our patients do this, because people can learn and it's really not that hard. So there are people out there, right, like myself and other people who can help families with this if you don't have capacity. So just, question more, is it really that they don't have capacity? Or is it just that I don't have the capacity to help them? Of course, there's always going to be patients who just are not appropriate. Maybe they're homeless, they don't have access to power, they don't have the education to pick out foods appropriately and follow food safety rules. Maybe something like a real food-based product would be better for them, or just a standard formula. So just take into consideration these things, but always challenge your thinking a little bit of who is actually appropriate for this. So the next section I want to go through is helping you get your patients set up for success. So there are a few things that you can do before you even start with the real food to really set them up for a successful transition. One thing I want you to consider is hydration status before doing the transition. So like I mentioned in that case study, this patient was really struggling with constipation. And when you start real food on top of that, that can often make things worse. I know we think, okay, real food will help, but so often these patients have never had fiber before, or they have not, or they're not getting the right amount of fluid. And then you introduce real food and fiber, and that can be pretty defeating when they start to develop constipation and they were hoping things would actually get better. Because really in my experience, if patients are going to struggle with something, it is something like constipation. And I really do think this is because so many patients are not getting the right amount of fluid. They're getting 70 to 80% of their estimated needs, and it's seemingly okay. They seem to be making enough wet diapers. If they're adult, peeing enough, their poop seems to be soft, and it doesn't seem to be a concern. But when you introduce real food, it's no longer it becomes more of a problem. So really helping them optimize their hydration first can be so helpful. But you might be thinking, like, I would love to get more water into my patients, but they're pretty maxed out. And so I really want you to consider the timing of when you tell them to give their water flush, because I know that the food needs to be prioritized, the formula needs to be prioritized, and you feel like if I give them more water, they're just going to have an increase in reflux and vomiting and lose more of their food, which is not ideal. But I think so often we're taught, and then we teach our patients to give their water mixed into their formula or given after. And when we do this, we're really expecting our patients to stay hydrated or get all their fluids when they're full. I know for at least myself, when I was, or if I was eating and I could only get water or my fluids in during a meal or right after, I probably wouldn't get enough fluids either. So something I found to be so helpful for my patients is actually to have them give their water flush or most of the water flush before their tube feed, because we know that water just has to be absorbed. So for most people, it should pass through pretty quickly. And then you can start the feeding on more of an empty stomach and you don't have to give so much. And actually, I find for many patients, especially my pediatric patients, they can get more at their mealtime because we're not mixing so much water in or trying to give them water after. But if you can't do the water before, or you still need to do extra water, giving it between maybe a first thing in the morning or the evening, or even when they're getting meds, they're hooking things up already. Because I know it's not as simple as just sipping on water all day long, but you can try to mimic that and just find other ways to get water in. Something I found really helpful for families, especially if there's multiple caregivers, is if they are having a hard time keeping track of their fluid intake, just put it in a water bottle first thing in the morning, pour from that throughout the day and see how far off you are, and then you can help them find ways to get more water in. Something else I want you to consider too before going down the path of home blending is if your patients are really struggling with reflux and vomiting, consider the viscosity of their current tube feeds. So like I mentioned, thicker food makes a huge, huge difference. And I can say that hands down, this has been a huge difference for so many of my patients. So if they are really struggling, they're in the weeds, they want to do home blending, but they just feel like they don't have time and energy for it, or even your adult patients that just aren't feeling very well, consider trying a real food commercial product that can make a big difference for their digestive issues. And then they have more energy and more time to try something new that can be a huge stepping stone and give them some momentum and confidence to do this. All right, something else we want to do too is get a height and weight. This just probably feels a little bit like common sense to you, but just want to point out it's good to get the height and weight at the beginning. Make sure that you are checking throughout just to make sure that you are giving enough calories and that sort of thing. But I do want to challenge how often you are recommending weights. I don't think it's appropriate just to check more often because it's a blended diet. This often causes concern and stress for the family, especially if it's just going to catch those natural ups and downs. So just use your clinical judgment to decide like how often will we actually see true weight gain and true loss, and don't do anything more than that because you're just going to be chasing this number and causing more concern and overwhelm for your family. All right, so then we also need to get the equipment, right? Because we actually have to prepare this food. So what do they need to get started? I want to show you that really probably they have everything on hand because, right, this is just real food prepared a little differently. So the only thing that's changing is it's going into a blender. They're cooking it all the same that they would normally. So I'm going to get into blender types and some tips on the blenders in a little bit later in the talk today, but to prepare the food, what we usually use, like measuring cups and spoons, a food scale, food thermometer, just household utensils. A rubber spatula can be helpful because you're going to be scraping the blender out and want to get every last little bit. When it comes to storing the food, most families and patients are not going to be making food on demand. So they'll be making enough food for the week or batch blending, making at least a few days at a time. So they're going to need something to store it in. The biggest thing is it needs to be airtight and sealable. So if families like to use glass, I would say mason jars are usually the most popular, but I see a lot of families using the deli containers. Picture the ones that you get like when you go Chinese takeout and you get those in like the little soup. A lot of families like to use those because they're dishwasher safe, they last for a long time, food slides out of them really easy, so that's a great option for families. But people will use breast milk bags. They have them on hand, they stack nicely in the freezer. Silicone cube freezer trays are super helpful too. And then there are now reusable tube feeding pouches. Picture like a reusable puree pouch you can buy. I mean, those can even be used for this, or there's a little bit bigger ones that you can put the food in, store, and then you're not transferring the meal so many different times because these will actually connect to tube feeding, the PEG tubes or the extension tubing. And as far as feeding the meal, so this is what Aspen recommends is okay to use to feed blenderized tube feeding. As you can see, it's probably what they're using for their formula. So syringes, reusable tube feeding pouches, large bore gravity bags, and feeding pump. We're going to get into more tips with each of those feeding, or what am I trying to say, those types of way to feed the meals a little bit. But one thing with syringes is that it's really helpful to have a straight bolus extension set. If you're not familiar with extension sets, some of them, these are what plug into G2 buttons, and some of them are a right angle, often for pump feeding, so they're not getting in the way of the shirts, and they're connected to that longer. But having a straight bolus extension set can really help with the flow. All right, so we set our patients up for success. We helped them with some of the digestive issues. We got updated height and weight. We got equipment. And so now it's time to help them actually prepare and blend their food. So this section, I want to help you learn how they can do this to avoid things like clogged feeding tubes and to avoid things like foodborne illness. So the first step, we have to make the food. I think there's a lot of concern with food safety and how do we make sure that they avoid foodborne illness, but it's not inherently riskier just because it's going through a feeding tube. It's really in the prep and handling that makes a difference. So common sense food safety rules apply here. Keep things clean. Don't put raw chicken and then use the same cutting board to use produce. Keep food at a safe temperature if they are making a lot of food at once, that it's not sitting out for hours at a time. I think the biggest thing though is helping them think through common sense of like, how do you avoid consuming the wrong thing? So for example, someone might go out in nature and think that this is really nutritious, but it's not actually edible for a human to consume. Or something's in the back of the fridge and it's sort of spoiling. Like, well, I'm not going to taste it anyway. We'll just throw it in the blender. If it's not safe to eat by mouth, don't blend it. This can also go though for if your patient's like, I don't know how I'm supposed to put this food in the blender. Like for example, a raw potato or a raw egg, or just, I always just tell families, if you're not going to eat it that way, don't put it in the blender. But if it's safe to eat it that way, it's likely okay. Now, of course, some of our patients might struggle more with raw vegetables, so cooking them first can be helpful. But from a safety perspective, if it's safe to eat by mouth, it's safe to put into a blender. The next step is blending the food. And so this is where we really help our families avoid clogged feeding tubes. So as far as blender type, there are professional blenders out there that make a huge difference, that really get food down to liquid form. It's pretty amazing what they can do. I have one, I bought a free Facebook Marketplace, and it completely liquefies like the smallest pieces of berries, tough pieces of meat, skins off of fruit, and that can make a huge difference for avoiding a clogged feeding tube. Now, if someone's not going to be doing this for very long, they could get away with a standard blender and just be more picky about what they blend. So don't use seeds, peels, tough pieces. And then of course you can use a fine mesh strainer, but I found that families were doing this with a standard blender and using very tough pieces. And then it's almost like they're juicing because they have so much left over and they're just getting the juice from that food. So then there's a lot of nutrient loss. We want to be careful about that. But some other tips, the size of the blender makes a difference. So if you've ever blended anything before, like a smoothie or anything like that, you probably know if you put a small amount of food in it, it sprays up the side of the blender and it's not actually getting blended in. So a lot of families like to have multiple attachment styles. We have families that will do a lot of food at once, but then they also want to just blend a small meal like as they go. So having options for both makes a big difference. And then the timing of how long you blend your meals makes a big difference too. So Aspen recommends more than or greater than 3 minutes. And I can say, testing out a lot of recipes myself, this is very true, especially if you have tough pieces. It seems like a long time, but it really makes a big difference. And so many families are like, they don't do it for 2 to 3 minutes, and then they're left with these pieces that are unblended. They didn't know. They try to give the meal, it gets clogged in the pump, and it's so frustrating because they have to throw that meal away. So these are all ways that you can help your patients avoid clogged feeding tubes. As far as storing the meal, so how do we make sure that they're doing this safely and avoiding bad bacteria growth? So Aspen recommends if you are going to freeze the meal to do so within 24 hours. If you're going to refrigerate it, it's okay to be in the fridge for 3 to 4 days. Before we had the Aspen practice guidelines, there wasn't really guidelines. People said within 24 hours, but Aspen says it's okay for 3 to 4 days. You sort of treat this like leftovers. It can be really helpful though to portion it into the meal size. If you can imagine like trying to freeze a big block of food, the middle is not going to freeze quickly enough and be at an unsafe temperature for too long. And then two, you're just dealing with freezing and thawing big portions of food and risking higher risk of growing bad bacteria. So just portion to meal size makes a big difference. It just makes families more efficient with this. So now I want to go into helping your patients actually start to introduce food. So how do we help them pick things out? Do they need to do things one at a time? How slow should we go? I get a lot of questions about that. So here's where you really need to consider your specific patient, because a patient who's an adult who's been eating before and now has a feeding tube for a medical reason is going to be treated differently than a 2-year-old who's never had real food before and likely needs to have that new food trial. So if you have a patient who hasn't had food before and you want to try foods out one at a time, store-bought purees make this really easy for families to test things out. Of course, they can make their own homemade purees, single food, or start to combine foods as they test things out. but that makes it a lot easier. Compared to your adult who has had real food, they probably don't have to go through this. Either way, though, I do think it's helpful to take things slow so we can get excited and we want to go to real food so quickly. But what I found is that from a digestive perspective, too quickly, too fast can cause some discomfort. And for the person that's trying to learn blending, that's really overwhelming when you go from not making any of the food to trying to make all the food now every day from now on. So taking it slow can be really helpful. So this part I'm going to go through, how do you help your patients actually pick out food? I think this is the part where I know I felt the most uncomfortable. I was like, I don't know how to tell them how to get what to start with and like meet their nutrition needs. So I want to go through 5 different ways that you can help your patients pick out what to blend. And as I go through these 5, we're going to go from least calculated approach to the most calculated approach. So the first option is to literally just make a plate like you would to eat by mouth, add it to a blender with liquid, the liquid that you consume with that meal. Maybe you need a little bit more to get it thin enough, and then give that through the feeding tube. This is going to work really well for people who have had food before, so older children maybe, or adults who have been, they had plates before and they can now it's just going into their body a little bit differently. This might not work as well for that 2-year-old who's never had food before. That parent probably doesn't know what's typical for them. They likely struggle with volume issues, and just throwing food in the blender is very intimidating. So that might not work as well for them. But that's not to say that they won't get to that point. I think most people, once they feel comfortable, will get to a point where they're just blending what they make everybody else in the family and adjusting just like you do an oral eater. But this is one way to do it where you can, share family meals. It makes it a lot easier to prep. But the cons are that you can get different consistencies, and that can be a problem for some patients. Another strategy, so taking a step more calculated, is to do a calorie equivalent meal. So let's say your patient, one of the meals is 300 calories. So if you're the dietitian, or maybe there's a dietitian on the team, you can help them come up with a 300 calorie meal out of real food that's a balanced meal, and have them blend that and give that as their meal instead of the formula. If you choose more calorie dense foods, the volume is going to be smaller. So this might be something to take into consideration if your patient does struggle a little bit with digestive issues and can only handle so much. Like a salad with just lettuce and a low calorie dressing compared to a peanut butter sandwich is going to come out to a different volume. But this can be a really fun way to get started if you have capacity for it, to help your patients think through these meals. You can learn alongside them. But it's also helpful to take things slow. They're just doing that one meal. Maybe they do that for a whole month. It's not as overwhelming or intimidating if they can just start here. Again, though, right, that some of the cons are going to get inconsistent volume and consistency. So some patients might not like this as much, but some who maybe enjoy cooking and like to experiment with things and don't have such a problem with volume could start here. So the next one is a recipe template. My guess is if you are at all familiar with Blenderized tube feeding, this is probably the way that you have seen. I know this is the way that I started out when I was still in the hospital setting. But if you're not familiar, basically it is like a template where it's, for example, 1,000 calorie template. Basically, you're throwing all the food in the blender to make 1,000 calories, and you give that throughout the day. It's sort of like an exchange system where it'll tell you how many cups of fruit, vegetable, dairy, basically your food groups, how much of each food group you need to throw in the blender to then make 1,000 calories. The good thing about this is you can have a lot of flexibility. Just use what you have on hand. Make all of your food for the day in one and just use that throughout the day. However, in my experience, especially again working primarily with pediatric patients, is so often this mixture becomes, you throw all the food in the blender based on the exchanges, and it's very thick. And so families have to add more milk or more water to get it to thin out. And then now we have, for example, 1,500 mLs of food, but that patient can only tolerate 1,000 mLs. And I've had quite a few patients when I was first getting started where I didn't make this connection, and we realized that they weren't actually getting their full blend for the day, so they weren't meeting their calories. And because there's some trial and error and some frustration with it being too thick, often families get to the point of they just do the same exact thing every single day, so they're not getting the variety that we think that they're getting. And then there's a tendency too, as kids get bigger or adults need more calories, you just keep throwing more and more calorie dense foods into the blender to get calories up without changing the volume. And then it becomes really, I don't want to say sludge, but it's just really heavy and often not well tolerated. So I think pros and cons, if you're, there's an adult who just wants to make all their food for the day, wants to know that they're getting their calories, they can use what they have on hand. That can be really helpful. But again, for some, it's not, can cause some frustration. So the next step would be to actually use recipes. So this is like, it's literally telling you the exact food to use, how much of it to use, and the liquid to put in it. And then you know exactly the calories and the volume. So then you know the calorie concentration. So this is the approach I've been using with families, especially working primarily with complex patients. This is what I use in the program that I have in the membership, and families have access to over 40 recipes in different calorie categories. So 1.1, 1.3, and 1.5, these are recipes I have developed, but you can find stuff like this online too. But basically then they can just start by replacing one of their formula meals for the same volume of a blend recipe that's also, like, let's just say 1.5 calorie per ml. So like that case study where I solely swapped out formula for blended food, nothing else in the plan changed. We were just using real food. It's kind of like the families making their own formula in a way. So this has been really helpful for getting started. If you need a more calorie controlled plan, a lot of families that I work with will just they'll pick 3 to 5 recipes. They'll kind of like meal prep on Sundays. They'll make enough for the week, freeze it, put it in the refrigerator, use it throughout the week. Next week, they pick new recipes and get new nutrition variety that way. The cons of this is it's not as easy to share a family meal. And I guess there's a little bit less flexibility, but for some patients, it's like they don't care. They want to know what the calories are. They want to get started this way. And then they work their way towards just, you know, blending home meals that they're making for the rest of the family. So the next option then would be to use a commercial blenderized product. There are so many products out there that are so awesome and have been so well tolerated by families. Ones that are 100% real food, ones that are real food based. We got plant-based options, keto options, but now ones that are freeze dried in powder form. So many options that make this so much more practical for families. And you know, even too, like people will do this 100% of the time. They find a product that's well tolerated and they stick with that. But so many of my families too will use a combination of things. So they get busy, they have busy days, they travel, they have hospital stays, and they need convenient options to make this practical. Like I said, a lot of people eating by mouth are not making their food all the time, right? So tube feeding is the same way. There's ways to make this a lot more convenient and accessible. And insurance coverage, I know that's always confusing. Is it covered? What DME provides it? But in my experience, every company has a lot of information on what DMEs they're paired with, how to navigate insurance coverage, even getting samples requested. Of all the Blenderized products out there, I think every single website has sample requests. So your patients can try this before they go down their insurance rabbit hole. But of course, this makes things a lot easier. It's expensive, you can't get coverage, but it can be a good option for a lot of families. So then just quickly, you might be like, okay, so this is what we'll tell them to eat, but how do we transition from formula to real food? I think it's really important first to iterate. It does not have to be this total overhaul. I think we get the thought that it's like, okay, we got them started and now we're just full into it. They have to get on their homemade blenderized tube feeding diet, but it doesn't have to be that way. They can just test things out. So maybe they start with one meal replaced and they wait a few days, a whole week. Maybe they wait a month before they replace the next one. Either way, I think it's important to take it slow, like I said before, with the digestive issues, but just to minimize overwhelm, taking it slow can make a huge difference. So next I want to go into how do we tell our families how to feed these meals. They're a little bit thicker. Sometimes there's some headaches with that. So first is syringe feedings. This is my preferred method if they can tolerate it because you can keep it a little bit thicker. And I've been surprised myself by how many patients who were on pump feeds of thin formula are able to tolerate syringe feedings of thick formula way better, or homemade prepared meals. So the one thing to note though is the syringes that families get from their medical supply company are often designed for one-time use. They have a rubber plunger, so with thicker food you have to use the plunger to push it through. It gets really stuck and it gets sticky. So the syringe that you see in this picture, that's an O-ring syringe. That's made out of silicone, that black piece, and so it slides really easy. It doesn't expand when wet. These are reusable. There are some companies that provide O-ring syringes through their medical supply company, but often families are purchasing these out of pocket. That seems a little daunting, but usually they're purchasing 5 to 10 syringes for less than $50, and they're not doing that again for 6 months. So they're reusable and they make a big difference. Because if you use a rubber plunger, it's like a little side note, but sometimes it's so sticky that you're pushing so hard and it sprays up on the ceiling. Like that's the last thing families want to deal with. So O-ring syringes are a game changer for so many families. And then just another tip, it's really helpful to actually warm the blended meals. Cold meals are thicker, so just warming them slightly to room temperature, a little bit more than that, makes a big difference. Of course, we need to follow food safety rules, but usually people with syringe feedings aren't getting them, more than 2 hours. And then pump feeding. So you can use a feeding pump. Aspen says this as well. There's just some things that we need to consider. One of them is the hang time, because our patients are used to commercial products that have long hang times. But that's not the same thing with real food. If it's prepared at home, it's real food, 2 hours or less. If it's hot out above 90 degrees, it's actually 1 hour or less. If they're going to be using a commercial blenderized product, it's important to check the manufacturer recommendations, because everyone's different. Some of them are 2 hours and some of them are 12 hours. So just make sure that your patients are checking that. And then another thing to know is that the feeding pump accuracy, it's not great in my opinion anyway, but it can be a little bit harder with thicker food. So some patients are relying on the feeding pump to tell them how much that they got. That can be hard with thicker food. So it's really helpful to actually just measure out the food going into the feeding bag. If they do need to track things, measure it going in, and then that's how you know how much that your patient's getting or how much they're getting. As far as gravity feedings, I don't honestly see this very often, at least with home prepared meals. With some of the thinner blend products, the gravity feeding can work fine, but Aspen recommends using a large bore gravity bag because it's going to have that wider tubing. And I touched on the reusable gravity pouches, but these are really helpful because just kind of picture the bag, and it can be disconnected from tubing. So you can just pour the food in there, store it that way, but then also connect it to tubing that connects to peg tubes or feeding tubes, or I'm sorry, extension sets. And then the food can flow through that way as well. So the next I want to go over, how do we help our patients be successful long term? So what I think about this is, how do we make sure they're monitoring their weight to gain excess or gain appropriately, or to just maintain their weight. And then we'll get into making sure that they meet their nutrition needs. So as far as how often you should be getting weights, this is really up to your clinical judgment. Like I was saying before, we have a tendency to want to do this too much because we're uncertain, but just do your clinical judgment based on their age and their current stability. But let's say that you need to help them make adjustments. So they need more calories or less calories. Here's where I want you to really think about this like an oral eater, because it really is the same. So if someone's eating by mouth and they want to gain weight, they need to have more at their meal. They need to have more meals or snacks, or they need to use more high calorie foods. So it can be the same with a blenderized tube feeding diet. My preference is if they can have more food for more calories, that's better, because that means more nutrition. But sometimes that just doesn't happen, and we need to go up on the calorie density. So that can be like how I use the recipes, going from 1.1 to 1.3 calorie per ml, or it can be if they're just making the food that they have for the rest of the family, adding in some calorie boosters or focusing on more high calorie foods. And then with the volume of the meal too, I should point out, I think we have a thought where our families often bring up, I don't think they can tolerate more volume, and they try to do, a couple ounces at a time. But for young kids, maybe just doing 5 mLs, 10 mLs to start every few weeks can get them to that goal in a more tolerated way. All right, and then nutrient intake. I know this is something we talk about all the time. So how do we make sure that our patients are getting the right nutrition? So again, this is just real food, given a little bit differently. We can really look at this like our oral eaters. So a diet recall, right? What foods have you been providing? Are you eliminating any foods? Are you avoiding a full food group? Do you follow a vegetarian diet? Then you probably need a supplementation and or get labs checked. But also looking for, like, is there a medication that's interacting with this? Does the patient have a condition that causes malabsorption? Or do your patients have low calorie needs? And even if they're getting a well-rounded diet, they're just not getting enough food to actually get enough nutrition, they might need a supplement. But you might be surprised that Aspen does not recommend routine lab testing, only when indicated. And again, I think we do this because we're uncertain about blenderized tube feeding, so we obsessively check labs. We just tell them they have to do a multivitamin no matter what. And with that, we're actually causing some risks too, because we know that the supplement industry is not regulated. And when we tell them just to do a multivitamin without giving them good resources, that can cause some harm too. So if they're getting well-rounded diet, they likely don't need that additional vitamin. Because like I want to point out, our oral eaters are not receiving complete nutrition every day. And a blenderized tube feeding diet often provides much more variety from whole foods than formula. And so many of my patients who get real food have way better diets than their counterparts that are getting a blended diet compared to other kiddos their age eating orally. So then quickly, I just want to go through some of these common concerns, things that might come up with your patients and things that you might be hesitant about. So I want to kind of myth bust a little bit and help you work through some of this. So clogged feeding tubes is a big concern. You know, our tubing supplies, feeding tubes are designed with formula in mind, likely. So there's some concerns with this, but actually literature says otherwise. When they compare formula to using blenderized tube feeding, there has not been an increased risk in tube clogging. What we went over, there's a lot of ways to avoid this. A good blender, blending long enough, fill the blender high enough, get the right feeding tube size, use a fine mesh strainer if you need to, but you know, be aware of nutrient loss, and then just make sure that you're flushing the tubing enough with water to keep that line clear. Food safety again, so this is something we talked about already, but again, this is not supported in literature that there's an increased risk of foodborne illness when you compare formula to a blenderized tube feeding diet. So same food handling practices matter. The reality is if you eat food in any capacity, you are at risk for foodborne illness, and you just need to follow food safety practices. So again, going through this with your patient, I think the biggest one is just reminding them that although you can't taste it, it's going into your body, and if it's not safe, don't blend it, don't give it through a feeding tube. Another concern is that it's too much work. So I often hear that blenderized tubing is too much work, and we tell our patients that it's too much work, you can't handle it. And I think we assume what our patients are capable of. And yes, it is more work than pouring, you know, opening formula and putting it through a feeding tube. But in my experience, it makes a world of a difference for digestive issues. And it's sort of a trade-off of, like I said, my patients are only blending a few hours once a week for the whole week. It's not that much more work, but on the flip end, they are cleaning up less vomiting and reflux. The feeding times are shorter. They have so much more energy. They're not talking to their teams as much. And so they actually get more time back in their day after switching to a blenderized tube feeding diet. And again, right, we have these commercial products that can make it easier to and also save time. And then lastly, I hear so often that weight gain is a concern and we need to get our patients gaining better, or patients tell me, my doctor wants my child to be gaining better before I do this, but it's so hard to gain weight when you're puking all the time. And so there might be a little bit of trial and error at the beginning, but you might be surprised to hear this too, that literature does not actually show that there is more of a concern with weight. There's been so many studies that show children and adults have improved weight gain after switching to a blenderized tube feeding diet. And again, when they're feeling better and they're not puking as much, they keep more calories in, and that really helps with weight gain. So just to summarize some key takeaways, I know I've said this plenty of times through the talk today, but this is just real food prepared a little bit differently. And I really hope to challenge your thinking because this is a new way of tube feeding that a lot of us aren't used to, but it's really not as taboo and daunting as we think. The diet can look so similar to how everyone else eats by mouth, and it's just prepared a little differently and going into the body a little differently. Something else too is not all or nothing approach. So your patient doesn't have to be 100% real food to get the benefits of a blenderized tube feeding diet. They can use commercial blend products. They can still use their formula, especially if they're getting started. This can make it way less overwhelming to switch to this type of tube feeding. And also the benefits go beyond what we may typically think. I know as clinicians, we're focused on digestive issues and improved health outcomes. And yes, we know from research and just anecdotally that it improves oral intake and it can help with weight gain and decrease hospital admissions and reduction in so many digestive issues. But somewhat more importantly is that people fed by feeding tube want to normalize their experience. They want to be included in family meals. They want to enjoy the joys of holidays and birthday cake. And all of these things are possible when you use real food for tube feeding. Also, high-powered blender, just another tip for this, because worlds of difference for my patients who are able to get the high-powered blenders. I should point out too, there are medical discounts available for some of these blenders, and even too, some of the early intervention programs offer, they have some funds to get some of this stuff covered. So there are options for families if they can't afford one of these out of pocket. And lastly, if you can, practice. I know that this is not always realistic for everybody, but if you are serious about wanting to help your families, I think you need to get some hands-on experience if you can. You don't have to do it that much, but I got a blender off of Facebook Marketplace and it just really normalized it for me because it was just food prepared a different way, right? And so this made a big difference, but I do know some clinicians actually create work groups in their hospital system and they come up with their own recipes, and just making them themselves, they feel so much more confident helping their families. So if you can practice, I think it makes a world of a difference. And like I said too, if you can do this in your work groups, come up with your own recipes, yeah, it just makes a big difference. So with that, I think it's time for questions, but I hope that was helpful to go through all that today.
Great. Thank you so much, Hillary. That was amazing and so much practical information. I can't thank you enough. And to continue the practical information, we have a lot of questions. So let's dig in. And you just talked about this one, so I thought we'll start with this one. Do you have any blenders you recommend?
Yes, so I would say most families are using BlendTech or Vitamix. Those are the most popular, most high-powered. Like I said, both of them have medical discount programs. You can get them covered by some of those early intervention programs. Some of the Ninjas work too. I wouldn't say that there's one that's best. It really just depends for the family and what they can afford and what they like, but those are probably the most commonly used.
Great. And you mentioned you were talking about multivitamins and maybe them not being necessary. What's your stance on salt with homemade blends or maybe some of the commercial blends that aren't complete?
I am so glad that you brought that up because I did not think to mention that. So yes, salt is important, right? We need that in our diet. And so often people, when they get started, they are using the healthiest foods, all whole foods, which are really low in sodium. And so it is important to include salt in your diet. What I usually tell families is just salt the food like you would normally, eat it by mouth. That's an easy way to just get some salt in your diet like you would any oral eater. Now, if you need to be more specific with it, the nice thing is home blends tend to be lower in sodium, so you have some room to play around with adding a little bit more. I've seen some clinicians for pediatric patients, let's say, tell them to do a 1/4 teaspoon of iodized salt once a day, and that can be a good way to do it. But for the most part, just salting food like you would normally is a big help. And then of course, those commercial blend products that don't have salt, then you can calculate it a little bit more, right? Because you're using those nutrition software systems and can see what their plan is providing and compare to their needs and then recommend how much should be added. But usually just doing it, in one meal a day is an easy way to make sure that they remember it.
Awesome. And speaking of the nutrition software programs, these questions are flowing beautifully here. What are your favorite resources for Blenderized tube feeding in terms of recipe calculations, how to determine how many kcal protein? Are you doing it by hand or what's kind of your protocol?
Yeah, so I use the app Chronometer. I know everyone says it different, but really any nutrition software system can be helpful. The biggest thing when I've come up with recipes is I put them in the nutrition software to see the amount of calories, just to make sure that they're somewhat balanced. I'm not too picky because just like any oral eater, if you rotate through these recipes, if you rotate through what you eat, you're going to get variety over time. But I don't want these to be like 80% fat, and then that's not going to be tolerated. So I use that system to look at the calories and then compare that to the volume of the blend, and then look at the macro ratio just to make sure it's not like, I don't know, 50% protein or something like that. But for the most part, it's pretty intuitive, at least as dietitians making these meals. I don't recommend that my patients do this unless we go through a diet recall and we feel like, okay, they're missing something. But I think that causes a lot of unnecessary stress to have them track everything so closely unless it's indicated.
Perfect. For your patients that are making like a 24-hour blend, how often do you recommend them switching up that 24-hour blend to get more variety?
Yeah, so this is why I've always struggled with the recipe templates because they don't get variety. They like stick to the same one. So, I mean, it's a good question. I would say I just always try to think about how are people eating by mouth. A lot of people are, rotating through like 4 or 5 different meals for the week, so something like that. But what I would say for someone doing a 24-hour blend, probably what they could do is batch blend that, maybe make 3 or 4 batches of that, and then they can make another one in 3 or 4 days. That could be a good way to get variety. These recipe templates, when they're doing 24-hour blends, are providing typically close to complete nutrition because you're using the foods from all the food groups. Often families are using a couple of different fruits or vegetables in there. So they're usually more complete than we think that they are, but I just try to be practical. And so maybe every few days, make a new one. If they're batch blending, try to make, a few of them so they can rotate through them.
Okay, that makes sense. Are there any foods that you feel like are more difficult to blend than others or create for lack of a better word, unusual consistency that you have your families avoid?
That is another good question. It really, I know this makes it hard, but it really depends on how things combine together. So it's hard to say that one's going to cause problems because my recipes include so many different foods, but I've worked on the different ratios of things to get these recipes to be a good consistency. I think the blender type makes a bigger difference. So if they're going to use more of a standard blender, they really need to avoid things that have tough pieces, seeds, peels, because that's going to leave those big particles that would clog a feeding tube. One thing to note though is grains tend to make thicker blends, especially the longer they sit. So a lot of us are used to thickening with oats, like oatmeal, infant oats, right? And the longer it sits, the formula, the thicker it gets. So kind of the same thing with Blenderized tube feeding. If you add too many grains, that can turn into sludge pretty quickly, especially if they're making it to use later. But other than that, I mean, like avocado can thicken pretty quickly, but it really depends on what it's mixed with, because an avocado with banana versus an avocado with watermelon is going to blend a little differently. And that's why, you know, practicing some of this stuff, and honestly why I've come up with so many recipes myself, so that families don't have to do that. They can just use these recipes, get used to consistencies and ratios, and then not have to stress about the consistency, because I know that can be a headache when you're really busy.
Next question is, for patients that have water restrictions or fluid restrictions, so maybe your cardiac patients or whatnot, how do you manage that from a fluid restriction and a constipation standpoint? Are there certain foods maybe that you recommend that would have more of a laxative effect and so forth?
Yeah, so there's not great guidelines with the fluid, but what I've seen, or I shouldn't say there's not great guidelines, I just haven't seen any like specific guidelines. But what I've seen in practice and what I typically do is estimate about 75% of the blended food is liquid or water. So it's kind of like our formulas. And when I do it this way, and I've heard a lot of other experts in the field do it this way, it makes it really easy to then sort of estimate, get a good estimate at least of what we're giving them in fluids, and then try to, you know, meet or restrict beyond that, using that 75%, maybe 70-75% if they're a little bit thicker. As far as, you know, foods to help with some of the digestive issues, it can be the same thought process as our oral eaters. So prunes, prune juice, chia seeds, things that help with things that are high in fiber that help move that stool through. But again, fluid is so important, right? With our fiber intake, we don't want to just max out with fiber and then we don't have enough fluid to push it through. So just keeping that in mind. But I think that as far as the fluids, just using about 75% as your estimate is a great baseline. Works really well for me, works really well for a lot of experts in the field.
For baby foods, if you're using baby foods in a blend, in your experience, do those go through the tubes okay as is, or do you still need to add fluid or some type of fluid to them?
The stage ones flow through pretty well. If you're going to use a pretty small feeding tube, I would say I haven't personally ever worked with anybody less than a 10 or a 12 French. And so baby foods, single food purees flow through just fine. If you're going to use more of the stage 2 or 3 where it's a little bit more chunky, then that actually probably needs to be thrown through a blender. And that can be a standard blender, like a, you know, your baby Brezza or a little Ninja or something like that, just to get those chunks gone. But if it's a smooth puree, stage 1 flows pretty quickly or pretty well through a pump or a feeding tube, or sorry, a syringe.
Okay. For patients, so for commercial blends, there's a lot of different options, as you mentioned. When would you recommend, or when do you choose a peptide-based commercial blend versus, well, a non-peptide or more of an original product?
Yeah, I actually love this question because this kind of like flipped me upside down when I was first thinking about this too. A lot of our peptide products tend to be like a pea protein peptide. And I don't know, I always have hard times. I think that our formulas, like our standard commercial formulas, we tend to think that they have a issue with dairy. So we go to like a peptide based product because we think that they have a dairy intolerance. And of course, some definitely do. But I've been so surprised by how many patients think that they have a dairy concern, but they can tolerate real food and they don't actually need like a peptide blenderized product. But that being said, there are patients who seem to tolerate a little bit more of the peptide product, but I don't know, not a lot of people actually have a pea protein allergy. So it could just be something else in the product that's been better tolerated. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question well, but I think what I'm trying to get across is that more people on real food tolerate it and don't actually need that peptide. But so you can always just, it depends on the patient, right? So you could start with a peptide just to be more cautious and be sure that this is going to go well, and then try, you know, a whole intact protein and see how that goes. But if you feel like, I don't know, they just have been refluxy their whole life and somehow they ended up on this amino acid or peptide formula, but they don't seem to have any other problems. In my experience, we've tried whole foods or tried a whole food product and they've been totally fine. So not the best answer to your question because I think it really depends on that specific patient.
No, I think that was great. It's very, very patient specific, right? The last question, and I know there is more questions that we're not going to get to, but the last question is, I think this is a good one to end on. What advice do you give to patients who are interested in a blenderized formula, but maybe they're not feeling super supported by their like clinical team or other members of their healthcare team?
I think another good question. I think for so many clinicians, it's just, I don't think that there's male intent. I just think that we're so misinformed by how we've been trained. Luckily, there's so much more coming out in the research, and as a profession, we need to be evidence-based. And so showing the clinicians these research articles so that they can see that their concerns don't actually have to be concerns. The new Aspen practice guidelines are so helpful. I think a lot of people are not aware that these are out. They're brand new. September 2023, they came out. And so if patients can direct their clinicians to reading some of this stuff, that can be helpful. I know I put a lot of information out on like debunking the myths and offering some ways to approach those concerns on my website. And so that could be a good resource to point patients to. But I think just helping clinicians see that their concerns don't actually have to be concerns and they're not actually backed by literature can be a good way to approach it, especially from a profession that needs to be evidence-based.
That's a perfect answer. Well, thank you so much. We're all out of time. I know, again, we didn't get to all the questions, but Hilarie, thank you so much for answering all the questions and sharing your knowledge and all the information you provided today. Like I said, the CEU certificate references will be sent out by the end of the day tomorrow to everybody's email. If you'd like a copy of the slide deck and you can't get it through the handouts section, please just let me know. And I appreciate everybody. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their Wednesday. And Hilarie, thank you again. You're amazing. You keep doing everything you're doing for these patients.
Thank you so much. I want to say too, if people have questions after, I'm happy to connect. You can find me on my Instagram, or I'm happy to give my email too. So connect with me, ask these questions. I'm happy to support you if you are really interested in this. I know there's not a lot of resources out there, so I'm happy to be one for you.
You're the best. Yes. If you want Hilarie's contact and you can't find it, you can just let us know at marketing@functionalformularies.com, or if you have my personal email at laura@functionalformularies.com, just let me know and I'll make all the connections. So thank you, everybody.
Is blended tube feeding, not my main one, just so you guys know if you're trying to find it. But anyway, yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.